Stop expecting people to treat you how you treat them. Understand it's not your fault. It's just the way they are.
You are Locked On Fantasy Basketball, your daily podcast on fantasy basketball. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball podcast brought to you by Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd, and as always you can find me on Twitter at redrock_bball and on Facebook at facebook.com/redrockbasketball. Here we are again with another season preview podcast. We're sticking with the Eastern Conference in today's show and going to be talking about the Cleveland Cavaliers, the reigning Eastern Conference champions. Now, when we did this show last year, there wasn't a huge amount to talk about with Cleveland, but things are a little bit different at this point. So I am joined once again by the host of the Locked On Cavaliers podcast, and that is, of course, Chris Manning. Chris, how are you?
I'm doing good, man. It's good to be back.
Last year we spoke, and there wasn't a huge amount to talk about in terms of things that had changed for the Cavs. Everything was pretty much the same. But even as we speak now, there's things that are potentially up in the air with how this team is going to look. And even if things don't change from today onwards, there's a lot different to what it was last season.
Yeah, I mean, you're 100% right. I mean, there's so much we just don't know right now, and it's really hard to kind of guess what some of the things could change. Like, it's not out of the question. I think that the offense could look different, and that's, just something we haven't seen in 3 seasons. So it's a lot up in the air. The trade's still up in the air a little bit, and it's going to be like a very, very fascinating season. And in that sense, it's kind of interesting. Been so static, and now it could really look different, or honestly could look the same.
Let's start with the trade, obviously, which is the biggest news probably of the off-season. At this point, we're still waiting to see if anything extra is going to happen with this trade. If you had to be put on the spot now, which I am putting you on the spot now, there's no way that this trade gets voided, is there?
I don't think so. I think you're looking at in a situation where both teams really have incentive to do this, right? Like I think like the Celtics more so, but I think the Cavs too. Like the Kyrie's is not going to be happy if he's on the roster come training camp. I think they really, really value that Nets pick, and I think they like everything else there, especially Crowder. I don't think this deal, it would shock me, to be honest, if this deal gets voided for whatever reason.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. I can't see any way that this trade gets cancelled or voided. There could be something extra added in. There's talk about the Cavs wanting Jaylen Brown or Jason Tatum, and the Celtics saying no. There's potential. Maybe they throw an extra second in there, or a late first, or whatever it is. There could be something extra added to it. But in terms of the basic skeleton part of the deal, I don't think there's much going to change. I don't think that Tatum or Brown are coming across. I guess that all depends on the status of Thomas's hip. But the deal, I would be stunned as well if this deal doesn't go through and Irving is not a member of the Celtics and Thomas and Crowder aren't members of the Cleveland Cavaliers. We'll start with Isaiah Thomas, obviously the biggest acquisition that the Cavs have made this offseason and getting him in that trade. How worried are you about his hip? Because I've been worried about it for quite a while. It bothered me that he didn't really address it for months after the season ended and didn't have the surgery, and now they're thinking maybe he does have to have the surgery. The whole process behind it was confusing and annoying to me, but how do you see it from a Cavaliers perspective?
Yeah, I'm on the same board as you, though. I think the hip is a major concern because I think if he was healthy, if you're looking at someone who was going to buy, like if someone was going to like pick Isaiah in a draft or like really look at how the Cavs might work as a functional team, Isaiah could really replicate some of what Kyrie did, right? Like he's actually better he was better points per possession than pick and roll last year. They were even in other categories, particularly in isolation. They were both good off ball. Like you could slot Isaiah into what Kyrie did, and it'd be fine. Like he'd be worse defensively, but like offensively, he would fit perfectly. When you're looking at where they're at now, they don't really have, in my mind, a starting caliber point guard on the roster. So like Derrick Rose is going to give you numbers, but I think he's an awful fit next to LeBron. I'm very, very low on what he's going to be. And then like Kay Felder, I think was good in the G League last year with Canton, but was bad in summer league and looked shaky when he was in the NBA last year. And then you have Jose Calderon, who's just not very good anymore and probably wasn't even a quality starter at his best. So I think this is a big problem for the Cavs. I think I wonder if they will try to go get somebody else. But the tricky part there too is you can't trade Isaiah with another player for 60 days after you acquire him, and he's someone that's not making a lot of money, so it's not like you can match salaries quite as easily in a market where a lot of teams are capped out. So the tricky situation. The hip is one of the biggest things here, and I think the Cavs would be. I think Crowder helps them a lot. I think they'd be a little bit worse off if they go into the season with Derrick Rose as their starting point guard.
I think there's no doubt that they'd be worse off if Derrick Rose was their starter. Now, in terms of you compared Thomas to Irving, and from a fantasy point of view, that's pretty much the same thing as well. Their stats are very, very similar. The big change I think that we will see between Kyrie and Isaiah Thomas is that Isaiah coming to Cleveland, he won't have the ball in his hands quite as much. LeBron will be holding the ball a lot more. And I think what that will do is it won't change his assist numbers really, or it won't change a huge amount. But what it changes, I think, is his free throw attempts. He won't get to the line as many times as he did. Now, he was one of the top free throw percentage category influencers last season because he shot 90%, as Kyrie did. But he went to the line a hell of a lot of times. And if the ball's not in your hands as much and you're not pushing and driving as much, because LeBron will be doing more of that, then he's not going to go to the free throw line as much, and especially if he is still battling hip issues. So I think that takes a fair chunk of Isaiah Thomas's value away. Maybe he loses a couple of shots to LeBron there as well. So I think that he is an extraordinarily risky second round pick. Maybe it's a third rounder, but we're hearing reports come out that maybe he's going to miss, instead of a couple of weeks, maybe he misses a month, maybe he misses 2 months. We just don't know what's happening with the hip. And I would be really cautious with it, and he'd be someone that I'd be avoiding. Despite everything he did last year, there's just a lot of risk factors in association with the drop that he's going to suffer coming to play with LeBron. Now, the drop that he's going to have coming to play with LeBron is probably a similar one to what he would have had playing with Gordon Hayward. But that reduction in free throw attempts hurts his value a lot. So I think that Thomas is a guy that I'd want to stay away from unless he falls significantly until we find out more information about his hip injury. What you said about Derrick Rose is correct as well, because Rose will have to start the season as the point guard if Thomas is not ready to go. But he wasn't a good player last year. He wasn't a good fantasy player. He doesn't hit threes, doesn't get steals, he gets no assists, he doesn't rebound the ball, doesn't block shots. He scored, and he did that efficiently, and that's great. But it's someone that you can add for the first couple of weeks and expect minimal production, but he's going to actually hurt the Cavs on the court, as he did for the Knicks last year, as he did for the Bulls the season before. So it's not a great option. And Kay Felder, Chris, probably doesn't even make the final roster at this point, I would say, because they've got 17 guaranteed contracts, or 17 guys on their roster at the moment.
Yeah, I think you're right about that guy. He's someone that I think, Dan Gilbert was someone that Dan Gilbert was someone who liked him, and I think that's part of the reason why he ends up on the roster, right? I think that's certainly part of it. And I think he's someone that could be a two-way contract guy, but that guy, if you're looking at a fantasy basketball thing, that has no value, right? You're looking at someone who maybe is going to just be there for reserve minutes if something goes wrong, and I'd be shocked, if he was actually playing minutes, and but at the same time, maybe he has a really good training camp, and it's so weird that we could see. I don't think he'll start. I think they would start Rose if Thomas isn't ready to go. But maybe he has a really good training camp, and they pick him over Calderon, who to me has no upside at this point. Again, this is just a very it's an interesting question of what they're going to do. But I would be shocked if he played a significant amount of minutes at all this year.
The other major part coming across in that trade, obviously, was Jay Crowder. I spoke about this at length on a podcast last week about the impact of this. Some people seem to think for some reason that Jay Crowder is going to have more value heading to Cleveland. I see no way that that's possible. He plays the 3, he plays the 4, and the 2 players ahead of him there are LeBron James and Kevin Love. So while he won't take a significant step back to what I think he was going to have in Boston this season with Hayward there and the addition of Tatum and Marcus Morris, he's not going to rise up in value. In him getting the 32, 33 minutes he saw last year, I think that'll be tough for Jay Crowder. Do you think that there's a possibility that maybe they do that and they play a lot more Kevin Love at center lineups, or is that just going to really impact what they do defensively, and they'll steer clear of that and give Crowder maybe the 28 to 29, backing up the 3 and the 4 with a little bit of that Love at 5 lineup sprinkled in?
I think Jay Crowder is going to be essential, and I actually, even pre the hip drama, I really think he might be the most valuable short-term piece the Cavs got back in that trade, because defensively, I think he's going to pair so well with LeBron to let LeBron get off the ball, and I think he's going to play a lot, and I think he's going to be used in a way that's sort of interchangeable. I think you could see him, in different lineups where he's playing, the three, or he's playing the four, in those situations. And I think he'll be on the floor every time LeBron goes to the five. I think he has to be on the floor, and it wouldn't even shock me if we see a situation where they're playing. It'd have to be the right team, obviously, but the Cavs are comfortable putting LeBron on smaller guys, and you could have Crowder at the three, still have your two bigs and Thompson and Kevin Love, who they like playing together and have been a very, very good duo. And you still have LeBron on the floor, guarding a shooter off ball and can roam a little bit. And I think that's something you could see. I don't know if they would start that way. I don't, not necessarily. I'm not sure if he'll start, but I think he's going to play a lot, and I think he should be part of any closing lineup they have, because I think you look at the way the league is going, the way we see the best teams playing, whether that's Golden State, whether that's Boston, whether that's pretty much every team except like San Antonio and Washington that aren't necessarily as modern. They're having small ball fours. They're having guys that can flex to these different spots. Crowder is essential to defending those. It's something the Cavs haven't had, and it's not like a totally like on 100% accurate comparison, but I think Crowder is sort of like the Shane Battier type on this Cavs team, where he's going to fill a bunch of roles. He's going to defend, take a lot of the burden off LeBron, and free up LeBron to do other stuff. And I think maybe that doesn't show up in numbers all the time, but I think he's going to be really, really valuable.
I think what you said there is key there at the end, that it doesn't always show up in numbers, because I don't see it showing up in his numbers really this year. His average draft position on Yahoo is pick 66, and to me that is just extraordinarily high. He'd need to basically exceed what he did last year in Boston. I think that's a really tough ask for him to do that. His usage will drop a little bit. His playing time, I think, is going to drop from the 32, 33 minutes he saw last year. He's just not going to be able to put up those same level of numbers that he did, and taking him at that spot to me is a significant waste of a pick. So he'd be a guy that I'd wait, and I'd be happy to take him if he falls later, but at that sort of spot, there's just no way I want anything to do with Jay Crowder at that sort of an area. The other guy that came across in the deal, aside from the Brooklyn Nets 2018 pick, was Ante Zizic. The Cavs center situation at the moment, we've got Tristan Thompson there. I talked about Love already, and there's Channing Frye. And the Cavs are looking at Zizic as a long-term prospect who's not going to play too much this year. Isn't that right, Chris?
Yeah, I think the only thing you could say about Zizic is that he might be an minutes meter, because I think one of the lessons the Cavs should have learned last year, they can't play Tristan Thompson 35 minutes a night and expect him to be fresh come June. I think they kind of rode him very hard. It was a big blessing in disguise for the team when he got hurt, just for that little bit at the end of the year, and got his Ironman streak broken. I think where Zizic could just have like some value is just eating minutes at the center spot and just playing games. I think he was probably going to play like 20 minutes a game in Boston this year, based on what people have told me. That was going to at least be a chance for him. And I think he comes in on day one, he's better than Eddie Tavares. And I think, like, you look at that, the Cavs could use a third big. They probably don't always want to use Channing Frye. The floor spacing is great, but he's such a liability on the boards and on defense. Zizic isn't going to give you the same spacing, but he's maybe going to be a more traditional backup five in a way the Cavs sort of need. And I think he could be someone that could at least on certain nights get 15-something minutes a game, just because they just maybe don't want to play Tristan Thompson nearly as much. And they probably, I would guess, don't want to always just go to the LeBron at the five thing all year, because that's just going to wear on LeBron as well.
Yeah, exactly. Look, Zizic, as you said, is a very good rebounder, and he can come in and help that. But in terms of his overall fantasy production for this year, it's going to be limited. But I still do like him long term. The efficiency stuff, he can score. He's not a great defender, but he can block some shots, and the rebounding is pretty solid for him as well. So I'd be okay looking at him long term as a dynasty type prospect. But his minutes this year are going to be limited. The other guys they brought in, we've already talked about Calderon. We've talked about Derrick Rose. They brought in Jeff Green as well.
My name is Jeff.
Now, with this trade, I think the Green, and you can correct me if you think anything different, I think the Green is pretty much not going to be in the rotation every night. I think he's maybe the 11th man in this rotation now, with Crowder sort of taking his role. Do you think that's an accurate representation?
Yeah, I 100% do. I sort of thought he was someone that might like just eat Richard Jefferson's minutes when they wanted to give Jefferson a little bit more of a break. But I think like Jay Crowder is like actually good, like I don't mean to like slander Jeff Green or anything, but like he just hasn't been like a productive NBA player in a couple of years, and teams buy into him, and he's just really not that good. So I think you're looking at a guy who like might just play. I think he's like, you could just see him eating up garbage minutes. You could see him just maybe starting on a night where they give LeBron a rest and just kind of eating on minutes. But I wouldn't expect him to be a legit part of their rotation. If he's going to be used, I think it's going to be as an auxiliary piece, because again, like I think Jay Crowder just is like they may have given Jeff Green a chance to fill the role Crowder is going to actually be good at playing, and I think that just diminishes what his value is going to be, because if you have Jay Crowder, why even bother with Jeff Green?
Yeah, exactly. That's how I see it as well. And I can't see him being in the rotation on a nightly basis. The other guy that they brought across, and this is an interesting one I think for dynasty people, is Cedi Osman from Turkey, who was a second round pick 2 years ago. Probably one of the Cavs' best assets that they've had over these last couple of seasons. He arrives now. I can't see him being a part of the rotation this year, but if things blow up as many are anticipating with this Cavaliers team over the next couple of seasons, if LeBron happens to leave, what do we expect from Osman? Because again, he was their highest rated prospect over those last couple of seasons, and now he's finally here.
It's interesting because I think before Crowder came to Cleveland, I would have told you that maybe Cedi could have played a role because I think he fits a need, right? He's a defender that, David Griffin described him as a Tristan Thompson of wings in terms of his ability to do a lot of stuff that maybe goes unnoticed in the box score. And I think, there's some value for players like that right now. But then you look at Jay Crowder, like, he's gonna get those minutes now. Like, what does Cedi do? But the other thing about him is he actually has money attached to him in a way that Felder didn't, that Tavares didn't last year in their rookie years. He has part of the Cavs' tax for mid-level exceptions. They had to consciously choose to give him part of the only way they could have signed a player this summer, to give him that money in a summer where they knew this was the last summer they had to sign players before LeBron could become a free agent. So, I wonder if there's some pressure to play him because of that money. I'm of the opinion that I think him in the G League, to actually get the league name right, he would make some sense there for part of the year, and just him getting reps because he's kind of still a young, raw guy. But it wouldn't shock me if you saw him just getting minutes, not unlike what Patrick McCaw did last year, because you want to develop that rookie, maybe pay him off for down the line, but you don't make him a cog of your rotation, an essential part of your finals team. You just give him a chance to do something as a rookie instead of just relegating him to nothingness like the Cavs have done with other players. But I think like a McCaw type role would actually make a lot of sense.
I think for him to get that sort of regular role, he'd need a guy like Iman Shumpert to be traded out, because there is just a lot of guys. Like, you can talk about guys on the wing, like we've got Korver, Smith, Shumpert, James, Crowder, Green, Jefferson, like all these guys playing the 2, 3, and 4 to a degree. There's just a lot of names there that he'd have to overtake. He's an interesting one long term if some of these guys do clear out. Jefferson and Green are probably gone next year. If LeBron goes, if Kevin Love gets traded, look at Tristan. Who knows what's going to happen with this team? There's a lot of things that could happen in the future, and Osman could be that guy. But in terms of this season, there's not a massive amount that we're going to see out of him from a fantasy point of view. What are his strengths as a player?
I think he's a good defender. Like, he's lanky, he's got some length, and he can really use his body in that way. He's an okay shooter. He's a good passer. He just kind of does a lot of like hustle work stuff well. He's not like a knockdown shooter yet. He's not like super comfortable with the ball in his hands, but he does stuff that you sort of would think could evolve into a really, really useful 3-and-D guy. You mentioned like the wings. I think the thing that's interesting is it would buck what the Cavs have done to not trust the veteran guys, but this might be the time to do it just because Green's, what Jeff Green is. You want to probably save RJ because of his physicality and stuff for later in the year, and I don't think he'll mind if he just gets to rest and focus on the podcast. I think Cedi could be someone that like you could like just plug in those minutes and just let him learn on the fly and see if he can develop as a shooter, because it's going to be an adjustment for him as well. Like, we have to remember that he's coming from playing in Europe. It's not like a whole different sport, obviously, but it's an adjustment in terms of the style of play. And he's also going to have to adjust to not like the best player he's played with on like the national team is like, Enes Kanter or like something like that. And now he's going to play with maybe the best player ever. And that how he fits into that role should be kind of interesting to see.
Yeah, it's he has got an adjustment, obviously, as a rotation guy that is coming across and joining a much better team. In terms of guys that left this team, Kyrie obviously to Boston, and then we've got 4 guys who were on the team last year at times who aren't back and aren't signed. Darren Williams, Andrew Bogut, Derek Williams, and James Jones. James Jones retired and taking up a spot in the Phoenix Suns front office. Bogut apparently maybe a chance to sign with the Celtics, and we've heard absolutely nothing about Darren Williams at all in this offseason. I am stunned that he hasn't been signed anywhere. I cannot believe that he doesn't have a job, because he was serviceable. Now, he wasn't great last year, but in a backup role for Cleveland, I thought he was all right, Chris.
better than Derrick Rose. That's
I'd
sort of
agree
my
with
thing.
that.
It's like, I think like the thing with him coming back to the Cavs was it doesn't seem like he necessarily like meshed with everybody to the degree they thought he might, and it didn't seem like he was necessarily like as kind of fired up about stuff as other people was. Like there was I don't know if you listened to this, and I'm bringing up Road Tripping again, but like there was an episode of that podcast where like they were talking about Darren Williams, and RJ was like, yeah, he gets excited talking about like MMA and vacation and golf, and it's like, did he get excited about playing in the finals? He was like, yeah, I think there was just something there where like they didn't feel like he fit exactly what they wanted in terms of energy level for the role he said he kind of came to Cleveland to take.
Yeah, I can understand that. He's always had a bit of a reputation as being a little bit of a prickly character as well, with discussions of him in Brooklyn and him in Utah as well. So there is that sort of, but maybe that's why he's not signed. So I reckon that's something that NBA GMs are really focusing on is character. And I think, and this is just me speculating, I think a lot of the reason that Paul George and Jimmy Butler got such modest returns in their trades as opposed to what the Cavs got for Kyrie, I think is somewhat to do with prickliness in the locker room and the ability to fracture things, in which Kyrie, despite this trade thing, I don't think that the players hated him or there was any friction in that sense, but Butler and George, there were concerns, and I think that's something that GMs are looking at, and that's maybe why that Williams currently remains unsigned. Now, this Cavs team didn't have any draft picks. That's not unusual for them. Go back to Isaiah Thomas. We want to talk about how do you see him fitting alongside LeBron and Kevin Love, or is it just mainly just straight into Kyrie's role? Does there need to be any change in what he does? Do you think offensively, especially?
It's a fascinating question that I will be very interested to see how it plays out, because you could throw him into Kyrie's role. You could throw him into doing a lot of the same stuff, modified a little bit probably, and maybe play a tad faster to kind of let Isaiah, kind of zip around like he does, because Kyrie's not, that as fast. But I think you could see a situation, and I've been saying this for a couple of years, so it's like I just kind of wonder if the ship has just totally sailed on it, because it's been 3 years now. But Kevin Love would be a really, really good fit in terms of letting Isaiah do different stuff. Isaiah is good coming around screens. He's good zipping around. He's good with handoffs. He's good at spotting up. Kevin Love is a good passer. He's good at dribble handoffs. He's good at stuff where you can roll him out of the elbow. I wonder if they would just adjust things to, make Love more of a focal point again, like he was in Minnesota, and give the guy who's been in the team for 3 years, who's been a good soldier, who's been a good locker room presence, and not just kind of give the new guy the same role Kyrie had. Like, I wonder if that's what they do. I'm very skeptical that happened, because like they could have done it, but Kyrie's not like Isaiah's not Kyrie in the sense that he's like this franchise defining guy who, was the hope post LeBron when LeBron left, and there's all these different factors that like Isaiah just shouldn't have the same level of kind of trust from that team. And if you're talking about maybe him having to acclimate in the middle of the year, I almost think like if he's going to miss a couple months and they end up doing this and everything, maybe making Love more of the focal point makes sense, because it would just give your offense, it would just make your offense better than relying on Derrick Rose isolations and pick and rolls while Isaiah's out. And then, maybe an adjustment for Isaiah when he gets back, but I think you can live with that. And maybe just kind of divide it up a little bit. But I don't know if we'll get exactly Kyrie's goal. It wouldn't shock me if they do that, but I think a lot could depend on when he actually is available to come back.
Yeah, I think that's totally totally fair with that. I hadn't really considered that option of the Cavs sort of elevating Love up the pecking order, but it is an interesting thing, and that could make Kevin Love a guy who has some significant fantasy value around that third or fourth round, which is currently where he's being taken. I think that's a fair spot to take him, but that could push him maybe back into the start of the third, end of the second round sort of area if they do start giving him more shots and running more stuff through him. So that's an interesting thing to think about as a possibility. So we talked about Channing Frye a little bit earlier. Do you think that there is a chance that he may not be in the rotation every night this season?
Yeah, I do, because I think they might just use a younger guy. I think that wouldn't shock me, but they like him as a pick and pop guy in those LeBron lineups, and I think at least in the regular season against most teams, when you're really just kind of nonchalantly playing, I think he's someone who could just still be useful in that time of the year when teams maybe aren't going to hunt people down as much as they might in the playoffs. So I think it'll depend a little bit, but um, I think he should be as long as he's. I think he should be in the rotation some, but maybe not every night, and maybe not for more than like 9 minutes. But I still expect Fry to play just because he's still he's still a really good shooter, and like he struggles with other stuff immensely, but he still has that one thing he's really good at.
Yep. Yep, that's sort of the way I've looked at it as well. I think he'll play most nights, but there'll be some nights where he doesn't. They run more love. They can put Zizic out there as well. And I think, he is getting older, or he's old now, so we'll start to see some decline perhaps in his shooting at some point. Now, Iman Shumpert's an interesting one to me because he played a lot more minutes, I think, than a lot of people would expect last season. He played 25 minutes a game. But to me, a lot of that was due to the fact that J.R. Smith missed so much time and Kyle Korver wasn't there the entire season. Now we head into the season with the assumption that we'll have Korver the whole year, we'll have J.R. Smith the whole year. So the Cavs have been trying to trade Shumpert for the last 12 months, apparently. Do you see his role falling significantly, or do you think that he is still going to be getting 20 to 20 or 25 minutes a game, especially when you consider he was out of the rotation at times during the playoffs?
Yeah, that's a really good question as well, because Shumpert's best minutes last year in terms of his PR and in terms of his shooting numbers was when he was playing as a starting shooting guard. When he gets away from that, he's someone who freelances a little bit too much on offense and is inefficient and takes bad shots a lot of the time. And I think you're looking in terms of what he could be. I could easily see him push down the pecking order because his defensive views, you have Crowder now to kind of do some of that, and he's not as good of a shooter as Korver, and like he doesn't have that one thing that I think you can really bank on the other guys doing. Like Korver is going to struggle defensively. Great shooter, all these other guys like JR has great shooting and is at least competent enough on defense, especially when he's played with LeBron, right? And I think like Shumpert just doesn't have that one hook. I could see them trying to use him. Last year one of the things was they talked about using him as a quasi backup point guard, and I wonder if they would maybe use that at least if Isaiah's out and they're just playing Rose, because then you at least have someone who's better on defense than Calderon and Felder, and that's like certainly a risk, but I think it's also something that could just make sense because it would at least give you a defensive thing. And if as long as he's on the roster and he's making $10 million, I could see them using him.
Interesting. We'll see. Okay, again, he's always the name that comes up in terms of trades. He's not a great fantasy asset. He's not someone you should be drafting in most situations, but I do think that he is going to see a drop in minutes, and he has to with Smith coming back as well.
And the Cavs, I think, if they found a deal that got them something back, whether that's a pick, whether that's a young player, whether it's whatever that is, I think they would trade Iman Shumpert. Like they'd have to wait 60 days to do it. But if they could find a deal where, they pair Isaiah and him up in a deal as in terms of like getting up to that almost 17 million salary range for a trade, I could totally see them doing it that way, or attaching him and his money for to someone who maybe could deal with having him for a year or two because he has a player option after next year. Just kind of doing something like that with him. But I think if he's on the team, I think you're right. He's going to get minutes cut. Unless I think where you could have some actual 20, 25-minute nights is if Isaiah's out a lot and they just need someone to defend point guards because Calderon and Felder aren't going to do it.
No, that's true. His defense is valuable, but offensively it is a struggle. Now, one thing that was I think a weird phenomenon, it happened to a few players last year. It happened to Victor Oladipo, happened to Pau Gasol, and happened to LeBron James. They all lost their ability to shoot free throws. Now, LeBron was never a strong free throw shooter, but he dropped by like 5% from the year before, 6% from the year before, which is a significant drop. Is there any reasonable explanation as to why that happened with James last season?
I can't remember who wrote the story, so I apologize to the listeners, but if they look up LeBron free throws, it might have been Haberstroh. I'm 99.9% sure it was Tom Haberstroh from ESPN. He wrote a story about how LeBron changed his foot position like 17 times last year.
Okay.
He was never comfortable in how he's shooting free throws, and you could see it in games. If you go back and watch, you can literally see him moving around and trying to find it comfortable. I think he might be a little bit better this year, and a sneaky reason why is Kyle Korver was coaching him on free throws at the end of the year.
Okay.
Kyle Korver, one of the best shooters ever, was giving him shooting tips, particularly on free throws, and I think that's something he doesn't want it to be a liability. We saw him miss free throws in the finals as well, which hurt them a little bit. It obviously didn't, make the difference in terms of them winning or losing, but it doesn't help you when you're competing against Golden State. So I think I don't know exactly what it is. It's got to be something with his strength and his body size, but I think he never was comfortable last year with that, and that's just a weird thing to say about LeBron because the guy's comfortable at everything else, really.
Yeah, it was definitely a weird thing, and it did impact people in fantasy leagues. LeBron, at his volume anyway, at 73%, is a negative influence on your free throw category anyway. So you always need to pay attention to that. But at that sort of number that he was shooting last season, it was pretty much getting into punt territory. So if you are drafting LeBron at the end of the first round, you do have to consider that, and that might enable you then to pair him with a guy like a Rudy Gobert and really just forget that free throw category, and you get your points and you get your assists from LeBron and you get your blocks and you get your rebounds from Gobert. And I think that's not a bad pairing, and just completely forget that free throw percentage and dominate the field goal percentage. It's not a bad way to go, but it was definitely a weird sort of situation to see it drop. But we'll see if Korver can bring it back to 73, 74%, then it's not as much of a negative as what it was last season. Now, this team is fairly heavy with veterans. Chris, who do you think, though, could be a breakout candidate? Now, you can define that however you want. A player who, I guess, surprises. Does Chetty Osman come in and become a regular rotation guy? Does Kay Felder outplay Derrick Rose? Like, who do you think is a breakout candidate on this team?
I would say Kevin Love. And
Okay.
I know that's Kevin Love's an all-star last year and all this stuff. But, I think there's a non-zero chance you see Kevin Love this year get a chance to actually be Minnesota Kevin Love in a tangible way, more so than just sort of auxiliary, right? I think he's someone that could get more touches. He if I was him, I'd be asking him for this because Kyrie's gone and he should be look, I've paid my dues. I made the sacrifices. Let me eat now. Let me get my touches now in a way. And I think he has a really strong case for that being a thing. I don't know if we'll get it. I don't know if the Cavs are gonna go that route, but I think it's something with him that I think could make a lot of sense. And I just don't know, how other guys would sort of break out, because I don't think the DNA of this team, even with Crowder, Crowder helps you defensively, but and he's going to alter your DNA. He's not going to change sort of the offense stuff. And Isaiah, I think the hip is just such a concern, and I just don't know how good and I just don't know if he can top last year. He was just so good last year, right at his peak, and he's a shorter point guard, and that's a concern. So I think if you're looking at someone on the Cavs who could just really, really surprise people and have this really, really big year, it'd be Kevin Love. And if you're looking at a rotation piece, it'd be for me, it'd be Osman, just because I think if he plays well, you could see the Cavs trusting him and seeing where it goes. But that also would buck some of the trends they've done in the last couple of years. But I don't think. I think Love is really in terms of just raw output. I think it has to be him, because if Kyrie's gone, he's the most obvious candidate to eat up a lot of those touches and points if they actually decide to go that way.
Yeah, that is. I'm glad you brought up that Kevin Love one. I said we talked about it earlier, but it is something that is a possibility with some upside in that range, with very little downside in taking him there. Because if he does return to Minnesota, Kevin Love, you're talking about a top 20 guy, and he was a top 5 guy in Minnesota. He's probably not getting back to that, but he could easily jump from the 40th guy to the 20th guy, and that's an interesting sort of guy to take a look at. Now, I wanted to look at guys who could be value fantasy guys. There's not really much on this team. Love at that 40 spot, there is some upside there, but everyone else it just tends to be a little bit too high. Like Isaiah Thomas is currently going at pick 17 with the uncertainty in his hip and how he translates on a new team. I'm not interested in that. Jay Crowder's going way too high in my opinion. Tristan Thompson's going inside the top 100 on ESPN, which just is nonsensical. J.R. Smith is going at pick 100, which again is nonsensical. Smith is a player who hit some threes but struggled a lot last year, but just doesn't do enough in other areas. And the addition of Korver there means he's not playing 33 minutes a night, just because there are those other options. Derrick Rose is going at pick 93. Kyle Korver is going at pick 102. It's just a very... and this happens a lot with Cavs guys. There's a bias towards them. Oh, these are names that I've heard of. These are players that I know. I saw them on TV in June playing in the finals. Therefore, I'm going to take them a bit earlier. So there's not a huge amount of value. You get a lot of the value guys from the teams that don't get much attention. Utah always has lots of value guys. Minnesota previously has had value type guys. They're maybe not as much this year, but teams that sort of fly under the radar, or players that fly under the radar. in terms of the other side of things, the guys who could bust, all those guys that I talked about, Thomas, Crowder, Thompson, JR, Corver, Rose, they're all going too high for me, and I wouldn't want to take them at their current average draft position on either ESPN or Yahoo. I think we've talked about nearly everyone on this team, Chris, apart from Richard Jefferson. He talked about his podcast and he's furthering his media career. He's going to, I think, fill more the role of cheerleader this season rather than player.
100%. I think, him and Fry and Corver, I think Corver's going to play more, but I think you're looking at guys who I think they might try to just have younger guys eat their minutes a little bit and just give them rest. And Jefferson, to me, is the biggest guy that, because I think they like his size. I think he's better still than Jeff Green. Like, I think, he's probably better than Osman, but I don't think he's someone you want playing every night unnecessarily. So I think you could see him resting a lot, not playing back-to-backs, not, going hard all the time. Like, this is a guy who, like, openly last year was like, yeah, I don't give a crap about the regular season. Like he doesn't hide this, and I don't think the Cavs hide it very well. And I think he's going to have a lot of nights where he's resting, and that means minutes for Jeff Green. That means maybe minutes for Cedi Osman. That means maybe more minutes for Jay Crowder. He's someone I think is going to rest quite a bit, just because, like, you want to save him for when it matters and see if you can get 10 minutes a game, 12 minutes a game in the finals, in the Eastern Conference Finals of the Jefferson that was essential when they won the title in 2016.
Before I let you go, Chris, I want to get your take on the over-under win totals. The early Vegas totals came out. I'm going to look at Kevin Pelton's win projections as well. The Vegas total is at 52.5, and Kevin Pelton's got the Cavs projected at 49. At the 52.5, would you take the over or the under?
I think under. I think you're looking at a team that's, like, potentially, having to replace all this production from the point guard spot because Kyrie is Kyrie. That's not an easy thing to do, and I think, like, there's an adjustment period there that we have to just functionally, account for there. The hip concern, like, means you could have a non-starting caliber point guard for a large chunk of the year, and those things are going to hurt you. I think they're still going to be really good. We also just saw them last year have a chance to, like, get to the number one seed and all this stuff, and they just really kind of fell apart the last week, and they didn't really care. Maybe there's more urgency this year because they are going to be incorporating new pieces, and trying to get some of that done. But I don't know if that equates to them, like, going over. I don't expect them to, like, go for 60 wins or something like that. Like, it wouldn't shock me if they went over, but if I had to pick one, I would say they settle in at 49, 50 wins in that range, just because I don't know how serious they actually take the regular season, and they're going to have a lot of things to just kind of adjust. And sometimes when you're adjusting and trying to figure out all this new stuff, that just leads to some losses in games you otherwise might win.
And that's sort of exactly where Pelton's got them as well at 49.2, and I think that's a realistic expectation, so I'd take the under on that 52.5 there as well for the Cavs. Chris, thank you for coming on to talk about what is going to be a new-look Cavs team with still a lot up in the air in terms of the Isaiah Thomas injury. Can you let everyone know, where they can find your work? You're on Twitter, and give us, I guess, what's sort of coming up on the Locked On Cavs podcast.
Yeah, so you can find the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, wherever you get podcasts. You can find me on Twitter at CWM Rights. A couple things coming up on the pod. We're going to have everything on this trade. We're going to have the impact, how it'll affect them against the Warriors, how it's going to affect their standings in the East. We're going to look at that Nets pick, and just to kind of have some fun because it's summer, will be a ranking of LeBron's best sneakers coming up soon as well.
Well, okay, I was gonna ask you, but I don't want you to spoil the results. So that's something that everyone has to. I've got 2 pairs of LeBrons, and I think I've got 8s and 9s.
I'll just say as a teaser, and I'm sure people could figure this out if they're sneakerheads. My number one on my list was picked specifically because of a colorway named after a location, and there was one specific pair that, like, made this shoe the number one on my list, because, like, this pair of shoes is the pair of shoes I wish I owned more than any other pair of shoes in the world, because it's just it's just an incredible colorway.
I think I know what it is, but I'm not gonna give it away at this point. But we'll have to tune into Locked On Cavs to hear that. You can find this podcast obviously at all those places Chris mentioned: Apple Podcasts, TuneIn, Google Play, Stitcher, and Spotify as well. And leave a review for both of our shows. 5 stars would be amazing if you could do that. And that's it, Chris. Thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much. Always happy to come on, Josh.
All right, we are done here, guys. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. See ya. J.R. Smith.